So my name is Jen Leland. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I have the great honor and privilege of training today with my colleague, Antoine Moore. Antoine, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Antoine Moore. He, his, him. I am a leadership coach and I am the SCRR field coach.
Yes, and I am the SCRR field director. And so we will go through that acronym soon, just to add to your list of many acronyms that you might have to juggle. Feel free to use it or not. So today, just a reminder too that this webinar is being recorded. We are hoping to get the recordings out later on, but just know that you will have access and copies of the slide deck and also the recording of this webinar as part of our resource library on our website, which you will just get so many resources. This webinar will be chock full of resources that you can tap into in the chat, and that will all be consolidated and emailed out to you after this webinar is complete with the recording and the content. So today this is our second webinar in a 4-month series that we're doing on the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project, or SCRR, although that has different connotations, but use it if it fits. The School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project, and today we're really focusing on the 4R's, so that's readiness, response, recovery, and renewal, and what we're calling the 5C's of trauma-informed leadership responses, in particular to the crisis response activities. And in particular for this training, we're going to be focusing on pandemic. We know that the pandemic is impacting all of us, no matter what part of the world we're in, although our friend in New Zealand might be less impacted, or not, who knows. But we figured we'd do the 4R's and really focus on pandemic, and then the 5C's, some trauma-informed leadership responses. So we're going to go through a lot of content, and then we're going to have some room at the end for a case scenario. And throughout, we'll be engaging in chat. This is our lovely SAMHSA disclaimer. This is a SAMHSA funded project. So this training is offered through the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project. It's funded by the Center for Mental Health Services and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and is administered by CARS, Center for Applied Research Solutions. And all the views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of SAMHSA. So we have the disclaimer out of the way. We've done some introductions. This is us on the screen, and then you can also hopefully see our faces in the video as well. We may have changed from these photos or aged. So we're just really honored to be with you all. Antoine and myself also have positions at Trauma Transformed, which is one of the partners with CARS on this partnership. And we're going to take a moment. I'm going to turn this over to Antoine just to have a moment of grounding and settling in before we dive into learning today.
Great, thank you very much. So as a way to arrive, I'd like you to just take a moment to notice that you're sitting in a particular context. Maybe you're in the office, maybe you're around your kitchen table, you're in a room, wherever you are. Take a moment to notice the sounds around you. What sounds do you hear? And imagine that you are on a reconnaissance mission, and so it matters that you hear everything. So as you hear a new sound, just note it and note them all, and then let it go. Notice it and let it go. Anticipation of the next new sound that you will hear. And as you're listening to the sounds around you, I want you at the same time to notice your feet on the floor. So you're listening to sounds and you're noticing your feet at the same time. And then just to raise the ante just a little bit more, play around with this, and it might be difficult, it may not, I don't know, but see whether you can notice your breath, your inhale and your outhale, as you are also noticing your feet on the floor, as you are also noticing each new sound around you. So you have 3 different streams of information operating at the same time. See if you can hold that for one moment. And in your next breath, if you could just release and come back and we'll continue. That is just a way for you to bring yourself very present to the current moment, inside and outside. And I will turn it back to you, Jen.
Great. Thank you, Antoine. And just some acknowledgements or invitations for those of you joining the webinar. We know we're also in a context where there may be many caregivers at home who, speaking of attending to 3 different sources of input. So just inviting you to do whatever you need to do so that you can engage and be present with the webinar as much as possible. If that means tending to little ones, by all means. If that means stepping away for a second or stretching or grabbing food or hydrating, the invitation is to take care of yourself in the way you most need to, so that you can engage in optimal ways. So again, an invitation to be present in whatever way that works for you. We will be talking about school crisis and pandemics. And so again, lifting up Antoine's beautiful grounding, the symbolism of it is that we are all impacted by a current crisis with the pandemic, and many of us on the Zoom may be also attending to the different phases of school crisis response, recovery, and renewal. So there might be some folks on the call who are also still navigating the impact of wildfires or floods that are impacting their school while they're attending to the current context of COVID and the pandemic. There might be folks on the call who are navigating racial reckoning and uprising while also attending to the pandemic. So again, just inviting folks that we honor and we acknowledge that people are navigating through very, very different complexities of crisis. And we invite you to take anything that is helpful from this webinar today, put questions in the Q&A for clarification points. And hopefully our role is to provide some resources and strategies to help you navigate whatever particular complexities you are currently navigating at this moment. And we honor all the work that you all are doing in that respect. So today, understanding the phases of pandemic and crisis response, we call those the 4R's. Going over some 5C's of trauma-informed crisis response, and particularly leadership response, particularly leadership that's both relational and reflective, and very complicated to do in a crisis response context. So we'll be walking through that complexity together. We'll have some time to do a role play or a case scenario to begin to apply the 5C's to a current supervisory case scenario. And before we get in, we're just going to level set on introduction to us, to our project, to the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project. This is our team I mentioned before, collaborative project between CARS. Livia, I believe, is still on the line from CARS, and so is Oriana is on the webinar. The Zoom room somewhere is a field coach with cars, and some trauma transformed team members are also on this call, Antoine and I among them. And we're also in partnership with the National Center for School Crisis Bereavement, and are honored to work in partnership with a whole team of national advisors and subject matter experts from across the country. We're funded by SAMHSA and part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And I think I'll just direct everyone to the bottom line for brevity. So our tagline, that school crisis readiness is essential, that response is critical, and what happens after really matters too, right? That recovery and renewal phase, which we'll talk a little bit about today. Here's our lovely beloved team members. You can see Antoine and I up there, and Livia, and some of our field coaches. I don't know if there's other field coaches that also may be on the Zoom, but this is our lovely project team, and we hope that if this is the first time being in space with you, it will not be the last time, that this is a 5-year project, and there are going to be so many ways to enter and to get involved and to plug in, and so we'll go over those toward the end again. The goal of SCRR is to promote evidence-based, culturally responsive crisis continuum wraparound services to promote effective and sustainable change in ways school leadership builds the skills, knowledge, and attributes necessary to recover and renew after a crisis. And our role is to really be in partnership and offer all of you whom are navigating crisis in the many complexities you are, trainings, technical assistance, resource dissemination, and other needs that may come up as you navigate this, so that you do not feel like you are in this alone. I'm going to bring this slide up towards the end as well, but this is a Guidepost document. And this is also another resource that you can dig into. This goes through all of the 4R's and voices from the field, people who have been through and navigated the different 4R's: readiness, response, recovery, and renewal, school crisis leaders, voices of experience, lived expertise, and comes with a guide and also complementary reflection worksheets that you could even practice in your leadership teams if you felt so moved to. So today we're going to focus on leading during crisis response. So what is a crisis? How are we defining crisis? Essentially, I like the definition we floated in last week's webinar, which is a big thing that happens. In our trauma-informed, trauma-transformed world, we sometimes describe it as when the stressors outweigh the resources, when the stressors that we're up against overwhelm our resources. And then I especially love this quote: a school crisis is when a community member or an influence outside of the system acts upon a group to cause harm or destabilize the community. Oftentimes, not only does a crisis take us by surprise, but it also alters how the community can hold one another. I love that last line. It alters how the community can hold one another. So there's also opportunity there. And so I'm going to invite folks, participants on the call, if you're so moved, if you want to put into the chat for panelists and attendees, maybe some examples of crisis that you define as crisis, or a big thing that's happened to your school community that is currently impacting you, or that has recently impacted in the last couple of years. So what types of cancer? Thank you, Paul. Absolutely. The death of a student. Thank you, Francesca. Hi, Francesca. Or a staff member. Yes, we see lots of that. Budget cuts. Suicide, yes. Student suicide, staff suicide. Yes, thank you. It is a reminder. Thank you, Fung. It's a reminder that the shifts we just made to a recent crisis is necessary and okay, and we have to hold each other regardless if someone who is in that role cannot hold some of the process right now. Exactly. So much of the crises that impacts us is collective, right? It's a collective trauma or collective crises. And so we want to support collective mechanisms to heal and recover from those crises or traumas. And thank you. Community violence, another one. So feel free to keep adding. And just a very wordy, I'm just going to predict the stressor, very wordy definition of school mental health crisis leadership. And again, I'm going to ask folks on the call as I read this to maybe just put in one of the wordy words into the chat that resonates with you or that you are curious about or want to learn more about. So we are putting this definition of school mental health crisis leadership out to you. The individual, collective, organizational, and systemic skills, knowledge, and competencies based on awareness and acceptance of the responsibility and accountability to create school conditions, climates, and cultures that empower others to navigate uncertainty and harm so that all students, staff, and partners can repair, regulate, and restore. So I lived up to the predictive stressor that it was going to be very wordy, but I'm just wondering which word, Livia put it in the chat, thank you, Livia, which word from the slide resonates with you or you are curious about? So Kate says systemic skills, question mark, great, yes. What does that mean? Maybe we're taught individual skill acquisition, but what does it mean to have systemic skills, to translate understanding of systems theory into application? Anybody else, feel free to put the word that resonates with you or that you're curious about. And Kate, we will try to integrate this into our training today as we talk about what does it mean for systems or school communities as systems or school systems to go through a big thing together, to understand that, to meaning make that big thing. And then what does it mean to translate this experience, recovery, and renewal into development of different systemic skills? So we'll talk about that a little. And if we don't, please hold us accountable and let us know. And I'm going to move us along. So we're going to be talking about COVID today, pandemic today, the context of this. But like any crisis happens in relation and synergistically with many other structural and collective factors. So we often hear this applied to COVID, that we're all in this together. And we are, right? Same storm, but also attending that we may be in different boats, right? There are school communities, for example, that have windows that open and just highly effective ventilation system. So they may be able to open up quicker. There are other schools who have been historically and acutely disinvested in and may not have the same supports and scaffolding to be able to enter the reopening after COVID or during COVID. So those are factors that have roots in systemic racism, poverty, anti-immigrant prejudice, xenophobia, transphobia, lack of access to healthcare. All of these factors influence how we navigate and the resources we have to navigate the storms that we're collectively impacted by. So we just want to make sure that we are always attending to the many, many complexities of crisis, and also understanding that there are factors that either will increase our resources or hamper our resources. And now I am going to hand it over to Antoine, who will take us through the 4R's.
Great. So what this graphic shows us is that during a crisis, we can expect that it will go through 4 different phases, those being readiness, then response, then recovery, and then renewal. So essentially, readiness is what you need to do in anticipation of a crisis. What do you do up front? It also is that a recognition that whatever happens, that as things are happening, new things are always happening. Changes takes place. It's ongoing, and you have to plan for other things. And so readiness in some ways is ongoing. So in some moment you might be getting ready to move into work or move out of housing, or to readiness to prepare for a new policy, or readiness for budget cuts that you're preparing for, that those things are evolving. It changes over time. And the next one is about response, which is when the impact of a big event happens, how do you mobilize to attend to it? So that could be, there's been a community violence, or a teacher has died. So how do you immediately respond? And recovery is when you have, after you've responded and you've the intensity of the magnitude of the crisis has hit, and you are either leveling off or coming down on the other side, and so you're having to find your way to move back into some sort of normalcy, or moving back into getting back on track, going back to where we were. That would be the recovery. How do we sustain ourselves might be another way of thinking about recovery. And renewal would be longer term. How do we think about, given the things that have happened and the changes that we've created in our institutions, how we might think about how our systems might be transformed to respond to these changes that we've just had. So that would be the 4 things. And so the important thing to notice about this is that it seems like it's, very nice and linear. And in fact, it's not nice and linear. And the other thing to note about this is that you can be in more than one of these things at a time, but the leadership activity in each of these things is different for each one. So it's important to kind of recognize what the leadership activities are, so that when you recognize where you are, you know how to lead. And so that would be, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but that would be something about why knowing these 4 different phases is helpful. And we're going to be thinking about not only the activities that you'll be doing, but also the sorts of the things about your being and your way of seeing that also matter in each of these different 4 phases. So starting with the first phase, with readiness. Readiness is about anticipating. It is about preparing, predicting and preparing. And one way to think about this is to predict and prepare in 3 different ways. Predicting and preparing for what happens with your clients, what happens with the community, predicting and preparing for staff, predicting and preparing for the institution. And so with respect to the community, we know that when crisis hits, that there's going to be stress that hits the community, and we want to help them to settle down, to know what to do. And so identifying tools for helping people to navigate stress, and knowing stress, and how to deal with grief, and what are coping strategies, all those things we want to, under crisis, mobilize those resources and give them quickly to the community. So that's preparing the community. Preparing staff is making sure that you have the skills and the capacities to respond. So unless you give the staff what they need to respond, they can't go to the next phase. They're still in readiness. And then for the institution, readiness for the institution is about anticipating the typical questions that come up in crisis, like, you know, who are the most impacted, who is greatest impacted, how do we find them, how do we find the people who can bring to bear skills that will be helpful for them, how do we mobilize our resources so that we can coordinate quickly, are the things that institutions typically have to respond to. And just to be able to have thought about those things and plan for those things is helpful. The capacity in this is to note that there's kind of an appetite, whether you have an appetite for planning, whether you have a thing for anticipating and being strategic, because sometimes to become ready takes away from current activities. And so you actually have to value readiness and what that will bring you. So there's something about that is a way of seeing and a way of being that is important to make sure that that happens. Next slide. So the next thing that happens is response. And so that's when you're gearing up. And so there is a way in which all of our nervous systems under response are activated and activated strongly. We got to mobilize. It's intense. We got to do things. We got to make things happen. And the focus of attention is around safety and protection, around reducing stress and reassuring people. So in that phase, we want to make sure that we have critical services that are being delivered to the most needy people, that we are attending to psychological first aid so that we are finding ways to calm people's fears and anxieties and reestablish a sense of emotional safety. And we want to make sure that we coordinate our information so that we get out information quickly, succinctly, in a timely manner for people. And that we widely disseminate materials related to all of these things that are related to stress, reducing our stress, and then emphasizing hope and resilience. So two other things to emphasize in response is that there are certain events, just to be mindful that there are certain events that might happen that can increase or decrease fear or risk. So if there's a death of a child, that might increase fear. If we don't have PPEs, that can increase risk. If there are hospital shortages, that can increase fear, whatever. So there are things that we have to be mindful that our strategy needs to attend to the fact that we might have an increase in fear or risk. And the other thing to be mindful of under response is that in this moment, which has a lot of activity and an intensity, that means that people are stressed out. And what happens under stress is that it affects people's nervous system and it affects people's thinking, and people become, their biases become more prominent, stereotype thinking becomes more prominent. And so we want to be mindful about attending to the fact that we have to attend to the inequities and stigmas that might surface, and how people might be further marginalized. So if, for example, you have a shooting on a campus and the shooter happens to be an African-American male, that you want to be mindful that your African-American males, all of them, that you might have to pay special attention to them because they might be targeted, or they might suddenly receive bad treatment, or fear is directed towards them, or whatever. So being mindful that the response, we want to be really clear that some people might need more response than the general population. So we want to counter racism and stigma through training and information in our activism. So next slide. So in this pandemic, we have all experienced loss. So there is the loss of, going places. Our rituals, our norms, our practices have gone away. I can't go to the movie theater. I can't go to graduations. Sometimes there's a loss of actual people. People have passed away, and we may not be able to, even celebrate their lives by going to funerals. So there are lots of things that have shifted, and the result of these shifts that we are not able to do things that we've done in the past create grief and loss. And this grief and loss can show up in multiple ways. So for some people, your grief and loss might show up as denial. Like they're like, oh, it seems fine to me. Or for some people, it shows up as sadness. Some people, it shows up as anxiety. Some people, it shows up as anger or rage. And so it is important for us to be mindful that we have to attend to the myriad ways in which people show up, and that it isn't only sadness, that sometimes people will push back and we might think of them as being defiant, but that underneath that might be just a sense of grief and loss. And we want to be mindful that it might have different expressions, but the thing that needs to be attended to is creating space for people where they can acknowledge, accept, and allow for their loss. That's the thing that we want to cultivate and create new practices and rituals to do that. And so we want to potentially do that in a tiered way: check-ins, debriefings, short-term, long-term counseling. One way to think about this is if there's a crisis, there's the crisis as it affects the people who've seen it, or maybe the people who are in the circle of, who are connected to the person, or people that have been affected to it, or in the greater community. So each of these need different things. So just to be mindful of that, and to be mindful of the culture and the religious traditions that people have, and to create activities that are in alignment with those things. Next slide, please. So after the crisis has hit, it will peak, and either we have to find a way to sustain over time, or we're coming down on the other side. And so that's where recovery comes in. And when we're thinking about recovery, the two classic things that we want to be thinking about are safety, for sure. And so there's physical safety, and then there's also safety that's like emotional safety. So there's wellness planning. So we might be moving back into the classrooms or going back to schools. So we want to think about what are all the things that we need to be placed to make sure that that happens well. How many people, what are the places, having the PPEs, how we're going to space out, open windows, etc. So planning for safety is one thing that we want to do. So in the recovery, we're moving from online to going back into the schools. That's a sense of going back to the past or normalcy. So recovery, we want to plan for safety to make sure that we are all safe. But also people have experienced a lot along the way. And so there's also emotional safety and wellness that we need to attend to. So in that, we want to find places for people to grieve and to bereave and to find their resilience and meaning making. So under this period of time, we want to name what has happened, to normalize, and to help people to navigate. And the capacity in this phase of recovery is that typically grief comes along with resilience. That those two things, if we are surviving and getting through, resilience is already happening. And so just having some awareness that is naturally the process, that our resilience and our ability comes along with our ability to confront these things. And so the recovery is just to acknowledge those two things and to have that frame of mind that these things are happening at the same time always, and to do and to be relationally oriented, because that is how we heal. So those two things are important to think about as ways of thinking and being in recovery. And the next phase is renewal. And with renewal, there is the potential that though we have experienced something that was really deep, critical, it's a crisis, as traumatic, that there is the possibility that we might find ways to grow beyond where we were even before this happened. So people who've experienced trauma in their background might actually have more capacities. They might have more awarenesses. They might have more skills than they did prior to the tragedy. And this can not only be true of individuals, it can also be true of institutions and entire communities, that we can actually grow. And so it is important to while we are doing different things to respond, to realize, some of these new things that we're doing to respond, some of those things actually, this mobilizing to do it differently in response to this crisis, there's something about that was actually helpful, to do it that way, to have these new practices and these new procedures and these new connections. So we can use this as the launching pad for rethinking and reimagining our systems, and to stepping more deeply into our shared fates, and our collectivism, and thinking about equity, and how do we build more of that into our systems, and to really appreciate ourselves and the people in our systems, and to just ultimately create new possibilities. So there is something about creating the capacity when this new thing has happened, to be mindful, to actually use that to go to the next level, to evolve. So the capacity here to acknowledge and to focus on for leadership is that when crisis happens, business as normal gets dislodged. We can't really do the things that we're used to doing. And so we have two options. Either we will devolve, that means we will react, we will go to lower levels of things that we can easily muster, we can easily settle into, that are practices and ways of thinking and being that we've done in the past that are easy to access. And we go to those places, and it's typically very reactionary. Or we can be mindful about not going there, but to evolve into something new, into different. So those two, evolve, devolve, split. How you find yourselves under crisis, where you typically go, is something to be very mindful about, and to have some intention on evolving and not to devolve. So those are the 4 phases. And what I would love is to have a sense from you all, where do you find yourself these days? And you might be in more than one of these phases: readiness, response, recovery, and renewal. But if you could take a moment in the chat box to chat, where do you find yourself these days? We'd love to hear where you are. And one thing to note about this, how this can be helpful, is that leading through this can be very complex. And one of the ways that we negotiate complexity is to be able to see the whole arc of something, and not just the phase or the specific moment activity, but to see the whole pattern. And if I see that I can be in multiple ones of these phases, and that in fact my staff can be in phases different from me, or different phases from each other, that kind of complexity of we're in all these different places, how to negotiate that is the leadership task. And so being able to see this and name this, and to bring people together so that they can see and name this, is one way that you can use this, because it helps to simplify. Right, okay. That explains why we're in conflict, because you're trying to be in recovery and I'm solidly in response. Or I have to go into readiness for the next phase, and you're still in response, and you're feeling like I'm taking time away from you, whatever. So there can be conflicts on staff, and that this helps us to negotiate those conflicts by being able to have conversations where all of our different perspectives get to live. So I see here that we have some people who are in response and recovery. And I see readiness and response, and on the cusp of recovery. primarily recovery, but sometimes slipping back into response. So you could see how, we're all over the map typically, and to honor that that is the case. So that is the 4 phases. And what we would like to do now is to just give you a moment to, because it's been a lot of information that we've just presented, to just take a moment to stretch. If I can have the next slide. Maybe you could just take a breath, stretch, get some water. I think I'm going to do that myself. Breathe so that we can gear ourselves up for the next phase. So let us take care of ourselves as we sit here together in community talking about this. So let us go to the next slide. So these are the 5 C's. So let me set that up. That when we are managing crisis, we are managing not just people, we're not managing just activities, we're managing people. So what that means is that we're having to support people's nervous system and honor their emotions and support them to metabolize. And so, we're having to see people's humanity show up here. And so the question is, how do we intentionally hold our own humanity and the humanity of other people in an environment in which may be very protocol driven? So what do we need to do to help people to feel honored in their humanity? So this list of 5 C's is to help us to connect people to their own humanity. So let's begin with the first C, which is clarity. Ooh, how important that is to be clear. In crisis, lots of things are happening. People are juggling lots of balls. So the first thing is to keep staff up to date with clear, accurate, and essential information. So this seems very obvious and easy, but in fact, when you have lots of information and sometimes contradictory information, finding out the essential, like this is the essential thing that you need to know, and to be very clear and very accurate about delivering that thing may not always be easy to do, but to find the data points that are clear and to accurately reflect those, just the basics, just the essential, is one thing that we want to do. We want to make some decisions quickly. So part of the clarity is like, we need to decide. We need to not be in the middle, but like make a choice. But as we're making these choices, we want to make sure that they're informed choices, that we're pulling colleagues in who are connected or affected by this and informing ourselves of their perspectives. And we're doing this as quickly as we can so that we can make decisions. And when we make those decisions, we want to articulate those decisions in writing. So the point of doing this in writing is that as you go down the chain, whatever these decisions are, the chain of command, if I tell what's happening to you, if I say this to you in my words, and then you go say to the next person in your words, and then that person goes says the next says what's going to happen to the next person in their words, we might lose something. It's a game of telephone, right? So so part of the clarity is to make sure that everybody gets the same information. So let's create bullet points, not a lot of text, not 4 pages worth of text, not a huge explanation, but bullet points that we can take from one level to the next and ensure a level of consistency. And the last thing is follow up hierarchical decisions with inclusive conversations. So that point is to say that we're moving fast and things have to be decided. And so we don't necessarily have the opportunity to give people as much voice as they would like or we would like. But after decisions have been made, we still want to follow up with giving people the opportunity to react to the decisions that have been made, to speak to their thoughts and their beliefs and to metabolize their reactions to these things. That is part of inclusion, even if they didn't get a chance to participate in deciding the inclusion is we still want to hear what's the impact of these decisions on you. So the last thing here, don't, is not too many words, or assume people have the same information. Under COVID, we all have a diminished capacity to listen, to reason, to understand. So simple information, and to repeat the information. So that is clarity. The next slide is cohesion. And so the thing to note about cohesion is that under crisis, there is chaos. So what happens under chaos? People fragment, they isolate, there's atomization. And so there has to be some way of pulling us together. Okay, pulling us together. So reinforcing that everybody holds a piece of the puzzle, that we're all in this together, support people to speak vulnerably and freely. So which we want, the messages that we want to say under this principle of coherence is, you are not alone. We are all here with you. We are together in this. What you do, it matters. What you do matters, and we are relying on you to do your part, and that your part fits into blah, 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 this greater thing that it is that we're doing. So these are the messages to help people to find their place, because it's hard under crisis to feel like, oh, I'm doing this out here all on my own. And we want to bring people together. So what we want to do is to not reinforce tendencies towards self-interest, to get people, ourselves or others, to be more focused on the I than the we, that we want to build a sense of team, collective, cohesion, coherence. Next one is connection. So be human, present, and available. Connection is central to healing. So the thing that I want to emphasize here is, in crisis, we're not just getting through it. That's not the standard. We're actually trying to do something much higher than get through. So this healing is about allowing people the opportunity to express their voice, to metabolize, so we want to be relationally oriented, and by relational, I mean things like whole person thinking, staying open to people during stress, to being able to express your own emotionality, allowing others to express their emotionality, to be vulnerable, to provide inspiration and motivation, to recognize people, to praise them, to see them. So all of these are ways that we can be kind of more relational, listening carefully, and ultimately we'd like to centralize relationship and have that be the driver more for things like productivity and wellness, rather than having people focus on authority and hierarchy and power. And so when we see concerns or whatever, we want to challenge people, but we also want to connect with them first before we stretch them. So the thing to attend to is to not move too fast into problem solving before we connect with people. Next slide. I think I'm going to toss it to you for this one.
Yep. Yeah, and I'm just going to lift up something that was said in the chat too, that I think is important. Somebody lifted up that offering additional training opportunities with the opportunity for team members to connect. There's a huge need for connection right now. So thank you for lifting that up. Oftentimes we work with school communities, and sometimes the only space that seems offered for educators in particular to connect with each other is in trainings. And so we make sure, as every part of training that we do with school communities, particularly educators, is to give them some time, even in that training environment, to connect with one another. Thank you for lifting that up in the chat. And another chat comment, good reminder not to move too fast. Yes, thank you. We often say when we do trauma-informed trainings that trauma-informed does not mean trauma-free. And that it's less about fixing than it is about healing, that healing and fixing are very different things, very different things. That healing is really asking us to be with it, to attend to trauma, to crisis, to be with crisis and trauma, not to necessarily fix it and move on. So very different stances. So communication. I'm sure everybody on this Zoom can think about communication gone wrong in crisis. We heard many stories back in March around 4-page memos that went out to people around protocols for COVID. 4 pages, definitely too much, right? So when we are in that kind of immediate crisis response, like Antoine said, we have less access to the part of our brains that can understand language, that can reason, that can cognitively problem solve. And so when we're thinking about communication, we're definitely thinking about clarity, the first C, constant, so repetition, going back and reinforcing, even if it makes you feel like a broken record, consistency, and multimodal. So multimodal is thinking about what is the best way for me to communicate this information? Is it through email? Is it through a town hall? Is it through a team meeting? You know, what is possible and feasible and what is optimal? And this is tricky. Sounds easy, but I know as a leader that I have maybe a team of 8 and 3 of them really need the information person to person or over the phone or in a conversation. And some people just need it in writing and very bullet point simplified. So doing the best you can, given the complexities that you're navigating, but paying attention to what's the mode that can deliver this information in ways that provides the most clarity and consistency. And then we often use the 3 R's: review, repeat, reinforce. So communicating early and often, even if you don't have all the information. Even if you don't have all the information. So I think too often we've seen practices where leaders, principals, site supervisors, educators often wait until they have all the information before they give information to others. And that can sometimes induce more stress than just saying, I don't have all the information right now and we're still awaiting different points, but I want to give you the information that we have now. Giving talking points to all levels of supervisors for consistent messaging. So when March and April came, at least out here in the Bay Area, we saw that telephone game that Antoine was referring to. And so one of the departments that we were working with decided to give the bullet points and give them out to all mid-level managers, supervisors, site supervisors, coordinators, so that everyone was giving consistent messaging. And then using predictable methods. So building in as much as possible regular check-ins, team huddles, 3-minute debriefing sessions after shifts if you're in healthcare settings or school settings, email blasts. And the don't here is assuming people know or can provide the same information to others. So again, that checking in. And this communication is, you know, again, offering from a place of relational leadership and relational healing. Sometimes a big thing happens and we as leaders can be seduced into the practice of sending out the protocol that addresses safety, but maybe could benefit from an opening line that is centering humanity. So there was a shooting at a hospital clinic and a memo went out the next day that said, everything is safe. Here's all the safety measures we took. Everybody should be back at work. So prioritizing the safety was a great component of that memo. What was missing in that memo, upon reflection, was that first line that just acknowledges that a big thing has happened and that we understand that people may have fears about returning to the workplace. And then here's how we're going to address those safety fears. So again, safety, but also humanity. We too often work in systems and school settings that have over time become dehumanized or trauma-inducing. So these are ways, again, to center trauma-informed practices and ones that also really deepen into our humanity. And the final C is courage. So it takes courage to be a leader in any of the phases, but definitely in the crisis response. And so courage, the way we're defining this, is really about vulnerability, about stretching yourself as a leader and prioritizing progress over perfection. So that goes back to, maybe I don't need to have everything figured out and fixed. Maybe I can show up with what I have, and allow others to know that we don't have this perfect, but we're in this struggle together, and we're committed to the struggle and to giving you what we have, right? And also acknowledging the way these crises impact leaders too. So humanizing yourself as a leader. Being positive, proactive, honest, truth-telling, not in such a way where the focus is on or whether you inadvertently create the context where staff are then caregiving for you as a leader, but leaning into the humanity a little bit, especially as you're leading folks through a very vulnerable time, a very tender time. So also being definitive and taking responsibility for your actions. Some of the don'ts here: don't fall into analysis paralysis, right? There is no perfect way to navigate sometimes among all of these complexities. Remember when we started out with our grounding exercise, I was really struggling to both attend to the sounds, keep my feet on the floor, and attend to my breathing. I was not able to do that perfectly, and yet that's sometimes what we think we need to do as leaders in the middle of a crisis where we're attending to so many things. So be definitive, take responsibility, but also, again, prioritizing movement over perfection. And resist the urge to blame others for missteps, even though sometimes in crisis, our neurology, our neurobiology, every cell in our body is reactive. We are tilting toward reactivity inside of ourselves, interpersonally, and we see institutions, school communities become highly reactive in crisis settings. And so one of our tasks as a leader is to have the courage to, in the middle, contextualized by high crisis, high reactivity environments, to begin to be reflective and relational. And that can be hard. And so the offering here in the invitation is to first kind of tend to your own reactivity, to notice it, be with it, metabolize it, and move it through so that you can begin to partner with staff and communities to metabolize that reactivity that happens at the system level. And so I'll just go back to Kate's question earlier on. This is a very simple answer, and there's much more resources we can get to. But when we think about systemic skills, one of the systemic skills is being able to, what we sometimes say, name it to tame it, to be able to name some of the reactivity that you're seeing on an institutional level. So the first task is being able to see it. The second is to be able to name it, and then to be able to move it through. So if we're seeing lots of high conflicts, we saw a lot of staff conflicts, a lot of increase in disciplinary actions with staff in institutional settings around the COVID onset, we might be able to see that and then name it as a normal response to crisis, but one we want to move through together, as opposed to devolve into, right? Going back to the devolve, evolve. And that takes us through the 5C's. So we have another chat prompt for all you lovely folks. Under crisis, which one of the 5C's, and we have them here, is hardest to maintain for you personally as a leader? Which one gives you the most challenge that you notice, especially when you're in the crisis phase? So would that be clarity, Would it be, is it harder to move from chaos to cohesion? Is connection harder for you? I know for me, I get into superhero mode and task oriented and task driven, and I don't have time for connection. We got to get this done and do this and get this done and move through. So connection can sometimes be hard for me as a leader. Communication can be tricky. I see somebody put in the chat, yeah, lots of cohesions, moving from chaos to cohesion, more cohesions. Courage, especially if you don't feel like you're leading perfectly and perhaps have already made some mistakes. Yes, with you on that. Being accountable and moving forward. Yeah, sometimes my brightest moments as a leader have been in the repair. Have been going back to teams and saying, I really came into that meeting all guns blazing, ready to just jump into productivity, and I totally was not attuned to the needs of my team. And so just going back and again, naming it to tame it. Clarity, somebody says in the chat. Some people have a higher need for details than I do. Yes. And again, we're attending to multiple needs, right? To multiple needs. Any others in the chat? Anybody have challenges with connection like me, or I think I'm the only one. I'm the outlier. That's okay. I'm okay with being the outlier. No, you're not the only one. Thank you. Thank you for the rescue. So we thought we would thank you for engaging in the chat. And then maybe thinking, which one are you good at? Which one comes more easily to you? Which ones, especially with respect to COVID, if you think back to your own particular COVID onset and how you were leading in the midst of that, can you reflect? Can we use some appreciative inquiry here for a moment and just reflect back into which one of the C's do you think, yeah, I didn't mess that up too much. Right? I know it's hard, and educators especially, so hard for us to see our strengths. But the invitation and the challenge for you all on the Zoom is to put one of the C's where you feel like comes a little bit easier to you. Thank you. Somebody putting connection. I reach out always to others, especially people who I notice are disconnecting. Lovely. Yeah, what a skill to have. The disconnecting too prevents the fractures and the fragmentation in our teams. And that can easily turn into kind of an us and them reactionary environment, not just on the personal level, but on the institutional level. So that connection as a harm reduction approach to that fragmentation is such a lovely skill to have. Okay, well, we had one brave participant. Any others who come up, feel free to put them into the chat. Which C's, and again, this is self-reflection as a leader, an incredibly important and critical skill, especially when every cell in our body is in reactive mode. So we're going to go into a case scenario. A case scenario. So thinking about the 5C's, yeah, case scenario. We're going to apply some of this to practice. So I will read the scenario. Ariel, a seasoned fourth grade teacher. She won Teacher of the Year in 2018. Checks in with her site supervisor, Antoine. Ariel is tearful, speaking rapidly, and reports that since the move to distance learning, she is just thinking about quitting. She reports, I'm not even teaching anymore. I'm no good with technology. I feel like my students aren't learning anything, and I'm failing them. She received the recent district memo to educators reinforcing that students should continue to be instructed to the district's rigorous testing standards. And this, she says to Antoine, this has really pushed her over the edge. She is wondering if she should quit so her students can benefit from a more competent teacher with better tech skills. So you are the supervisor, and Ariel is one of your most gifted teachers. often serves as a mentor to other educators, and she is coming to you. She's coming to you with this. So maybe engaging in the chat.
Which of these 5C's, clarity, cohesion, connect, communicate, and courage, which of those feels like a place that you would want to go with this person?
So somebody put in connect, yeah. So how might, again, another connection, and how might we begin with connection? That's great. Yeah. People want to put that in the chat too, right? Connection and cohesion, right? So she's speaking rapidly, so that might be a sign that she's in a bit of chaos. And we often know that cohesion comes through connection, right? So that co-regulation, we call it co-regulation. Sometimes, especially in crisis, we're more apt to regulate our nervous systems through co-regulation than we are through self-regulation. And that happens through connection, through validating her feelings, validating her experiences. Thank you. Acknowledging her distress, being with her in that, not jumping to fix it right away, but just being with her in that so she doesn't feel so alone in it. Others.
Jen, going back to the slide that says connection. So I'm curious whether anyone might, I see the validating her experience and acknowledging, whether anyone else has any ideas of what the practice of this connection might look like. So she's distressed. She feels incompetent. She feels ineffective. She's ready to quit. And what a resource she is, but she doesn't feel her resourcefulness. She's self-critical. So what might be some of the words that you would say to someone who has that view of themselves and of the situation? So Francesca says, show care and concern. Right. Adriana or Adriana, I'm not sure how you say your name, says to reframe her experience.
And I think that that's a tricky one. I think, before I think reframing is incredibly powerful and important to also, just validate before we jump into reframe her experience. So sometimes that can look in just saying, wow, this is hard. It sounds like this has been incredibly hard, feeling for the first time, how hard it is to be an educator in this context. And you are absolutely not the only one feeling this way.
Yeah, and to acknowledge that that she probably is, because she's a very seasoned person, she's used to having a certain self experience as a teacher, and so there's a sense of loss, like that's not the experience I'm having of myself at all, and how distressing that is to, and how we have a sense of like our value by having this particular kind of feeling of ourselves, and to say, hey, and I know that it must feel tremendously disconcerting to have all of this knowledge and capacity and skill and to feel like you can't even deliver it. How frustrating and how decentering that must feel.
Somebody brings up in the chat, a lot will depend on your previous relationship with her dictating the approach you take. Absolutely, right? So kind of modulating or right size the depth of that connection. And even as a leader, kind of understanding your own capacity for that conversation. Right? Where can you enter that connection piece? Somebody else writes in the chat, before moving into any focus on a solution, I reflect what she said to not only validate, but be sure I heard her as she wants to be heard and to see if it prompts her to provide for insight. Yes, exactly. Beautifully stated. Thank you.
Yes.
So sometimes it helps to almost repeat back some of the words they said. Not to say, yeah, you really are incompetent, right? But to say, I really hear the struggle and the loss of yourself is feeling affected, like Antoine said. I'm really hearing that pain of that loss in this new environment and that struggle.
Adriana says, yes, acknowledge how hard first, definitely. Plus, she was a winner of a prize. That's also true. And it's hard to feel out of control. Validate that. So then.
Cup of coffee in a safe space. Yes. Or kava or tea. If, if we have the means to do that, right? And it might need to be over telehealth, right? Over distance learning on the Zoom screen. But yeah, some ability to be with her a little bit before jumping into the problem solving. One more C, connection, coherence. Is there any other C that people want to play with? What about communication? Part of this little vignette or this case scenario was that what threw her over the edge was the memo that kind of had the, sometimes the systems when we're in a crisis response or reactivity mode, we can become hyper vigilant, or institutions can become hyper vigilant and focused on risk mitigation. Not that we shouldn't focus on being accountable, but again, maybe processing with her experience of that memo that came out that was reminding educators to continue to be held to the highest rigorous standards and continue teaching in this environment to the test standards. So what was her experience of that memo?
Someone says she needs a very personal response, not another email. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, she's asking for that connection. And somebody else, I forget who it was, lifted up that sometimes, and this has been my experience too, sometimes when we can sit with them, they are more likely through that co-regulation, through that validation and being with them in their experience, then they will be able to access that part of the brain that can begin to solve problems or move forward in a way that gives them agency and that feels resonant for them. So if we can just sit with them a little bit, not jump to fixing, which can be very difficult for us as leaders sometimes, right? But if we can just sit, it's been my experience that people through this co-regulation often find the solutions after feeling a little bit held and validated. And at the very least, we would be in partnership with them to find solutions or to move forward, and giving people both voice and choice as much as possible. Voice and how they want to move forward, choice and how they want to move forward. But again, we like to say this, connect before redirect, right? So connect, connect, connect. Any final thoughts or reflections, Antoine, you want to put into this case scenario before we move forward and close out?
No, I think we're good. Let's go
Okay.
to our closeout.
Okay. Well, Livia is going to put the 5C's document. We created this for a crisis response environment for leaders who also, like staff, don't have a lot of brain capacity or cognitive capacity sometimes to get a 40-page toolkit. So Livia is putting the 5C's that you can download and print out or keep handy or keep on your desktop somewhere if you need a quick reference, a quick reminder. And I think Livia is also going to put a longer document that Antoine created around leading self, leading others, leading schools or organizations. So there's 3 kind of different pieces of leading and practices in each of those. And I just want to thank everyone again for attending this Zoom. And I hope that people were able to get something valuable out of it. And I want to also invite next Thursday, a week from today, we will be having a coaching clinic. And so we've gone through a lot of content. Some of you have been on multiple webinars. Next week is the opportunity to take the learnings and put them in practice, not on a webinar, but in a regular Zoom format, so we can have some interactive and breakout rooms and connection. So you all can connect with each other, not just on chat, but in the Zoom room. So please join us for that if you can. So summing up today, communicate. I would add connection. Preparing and pivoting our focus to the psychosocial and organizational supports needed for the phase and hotspots of a pandemic. And again, to be thinking about surges, especially in this time, right? In the US, some parts of the US are in a surge. Other parts of the US may be right behind them in a 3rd surge or a 2nd surge. So again, we're getting many opportunities to practice, to put into practice. How do we need to attend to our leadership strategies when there's a surge or a tipping point? That this is not leadership as usual. It's not teaching as usual. It's not therapy as usual or healthcare as usual in a crisis context. So just remembering that. We have a coworker of ours who reminds me constantly, we're not working from home. We are in a pandemic, trying our best to work from home during a pandemic. So even that reframing can center this. And that leadership can be a buffer or an agent to mitigate further risk and loss. And then looking ahead, we hope that all of you join us for other learnings and other ways to get involved. And so I'm going to go through this very quickly. Here are some upcoming learning opportunities. We are also doing an altar, yay, for Dia de los Muertos. There's a link to submit your altar offering by 10/27, which is around the corner, so please do. So if you've lost anyone, an educator, a school community member, a student, anybody close in your beloved family and community circles, this is a great way to honor them. For October, November, December, January, we're doing level setting foundational modules. You were in one today, thank you, on crisis response. And next month, we'll be jumping into recovery. And then in December, January, we'll be jumping into renewal. And then there's also an upcoming institute, Grief Mental Health Technology Transfer Centers Networks Grief Sensitivity Virtual Institute. So that will be back for part 2. So please download the flyer. We will send links and resources. It will also be up on our website. So again, these are the level setting foundational modules. And basically the thing to say here very briefly is that there will usually in every month, this was October, we had 2 webinars and 1 coaching clinic. So next month there will be 2 webinars to go over content and then a coaching clinic that will follow them. In December and January, there's also going to be some student-centered and educator-centered institutes on renewal practices, and even creating grief rituals in classroom settings to help with that recovery and renewal practice. So look out for those. And here are all our offerings. Look how many offerings, look how many opportunities we get to be in space together here. So this goes through, again, the core foundational modules, the content, and then into the coaching clinics. Again, we're recording this, and we will send out the recording and all the ways to plug in. And then I mentioned this Guidepost document in the beginning. This is an incredible document based on lots of key informant interviews with folks across the region in school settings who have been through crisis response, recovery, renewal. And so highly encourage folks to check this out. And finally, thank you for attending. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being in community. We know your time is valuable, and we really, really appreciate your engagement here with us today. We would ask you to take a few minutes to give us your feedback. We review all feedback and incorporate your suggestions, what worked, what didn't work, into our and in our reports to our funder. So the feedback form will appear on your screen when the webinar ends, and will also be included in follow-up email. And finally, this is all our social medias, our website. There are ways to get involved, not just with webinars, but also if you want to request intensive supports or TA specific to your school community, you can do that on our website under a TA request, especially if you are struggling with the tensions of, wow, we went through a big thing 2 years ago, a fire, a flood, school shooting, student suicide, and now we're attending to this crisis of COVID. How do we do this, right? How do we both navigate recovery and renewal from a big thing that happened maybe last year or the year before, while we are attending to this moment in time with the multiple pandemics we are in? So please, please check out our website, contact us, connect with us on the Facebooks and the IGs and the Twitters, and let us know how you would like to get involved. We have many, many opportunities to plug in, and we will close with a thank you. And if anyone wants to write in the chat one aha or takeaway that they'll be leaving from this webinar, or maybe one curiosity that you still have as you're leaving the webinar, and we will stay on the line as those come in. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.